shadows of the Teton Mountain Range on a summer night in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, a group of local neighbors gathered to share a vision, an ideal balance between conservation and development. Their grassroots strategy launched a series of political events wild enough to have come from the pages of Old West fiction. A showdown between some of history's most captivating characters. A Western saga still echoing through the American range.
As the world knows, 97% of Teton County is in public hands, thank God, because there's only 3% they can ruin.
The Jackson Hole story is made possible in part by a gift from the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Fund and the contributing members of KUED.
They met on a summer's night in 1923. A handful of locals bent on saving the soul of their corner of the West. In the Snake River cabin, they feared it might already be too late for Jackson Hole. For centuries, the valley locked amid Teton Peaks was unfettered by settlement. The Wind River Shoshone people originally inhabited the area. Early explorers and fur trappers came later. As the United States grew from the east, homesteaders went west. Expansion across the continent, well, it seemed inevitable. It was manifest destiny. Ranchers and farms sprouted up, Mormon pioneers came, and the town of Jackson grew. Soon the Iron Horse brought adventurers and sport hunters to the Rockies. More and more tin-can tourists drove their Model Ts through America's first national park, Yellowstone. The landscape of nearby Jackson Hole was changing by the minute.
Well, I can remember when there were billboards from Jackson to Jenny Lake. You can't have driven very far if you don't know whose signs these are. Burma Shave. Rip a fender off your car, mail it in for a half-pound jar, Burma Shave, right along that highway. There were all kinds of ticky-tack.
There were power lines strung up on the west side of the road that bisected the view of the Teton Range, and there was a burned-out gas station, and there was a speakeasy saloon, and there was kind of a rodeo ground of sorts that was there, and all of this development really drove home the point that this area might need better treatment than that.
The locals felt the very essence of what they called home was at stake.
The meeting at Maud Noble's cabin was probably motivated more than anything by fear. Fear of what might happen. You want to remember that this is right after World War I, and tourism is increasing by leaps and bounds in both Yellowstone and Jackson Hole. And they were worried about what might happen. I think they kind of anticipated the possibility of development and subdivisions, etc. So they wanted to, and somehow, save the open space.
Gathered around Maud Noble's hearth were Struthers Burt of the Bar BC Dude Ranch, joined by his partner Horace Carncross, newspaperman Dick Winger, grocery store owner Joe Jones, and cattle rancher Jack Enon. Yellowstone Superintendent Horace Albright was also there. The youthful bureaucrat had been invited to join their discussion.
My recollection over all these years, it was just a gathering around a hearth in a log cabin, people discussing. That is, it was the first time that that some of these old-time Jackson Hole ranchers of importance who had property, hard property, that were willing to talk about the preservation of the country. First time they were willing to meet with a conservationist.
Horace Albright, of course, wanted it to be a national park. He basically really always envisioned either adding on Jackson Hole and the Teton Range as an extension of Yellowstone National Park, or creating a separate park down here to preserve this wonderful landscape. But the other folks were coming from a more multi-use point of view where wildlife could continue about their daily activities, and that, the area would maintain that western kind of flavor.
They developed a plan that called for miles of open space. It required new buildings to be Western style, and it limited paved roads. It fostered traditional hunting, grazing, and dude ranching. They figured all they needed now was to find a wealthy philanthropist, an investor in their vision. Soon after, Struthers Burt would pen a letter.
For God's sake, let's put this thing over. It is the biggest idea of its kind since the actual inception of Yellowstone itself. A natural history museum on the hoof. The only thing of its kind in the world. Struthers Burt.
He was very much into the myth of the West, and he presented it in a very attractive way at the Bar BC Ranch. And so when they got together, he wanted the theme really to be horses, and the cowboys, and log cabins. It was in his interest because he was, by 1923, he had a flourishing dude ranch business, bringing Easterners out, and they came out here to enjoy what I like to think is a close but comfortable relationship with nature. Living in a cabin, getting on your horse, riding all day through the sagebrush, out to the mountains, or over to a lake to have a picnic. It was a wonderful life, and that's what he wanted to preserve.
Now, Struthers Burt had a genteel idea of Jackson, far different than life on the hoof known to the homesteaders. They had planted their roots in the valley. Now they were finding it hard to live their Western dream.
I had a job the second day I was here over on Mormon Road thrashing, and was thrashing oats. That old bale and wire outfit, we'd thrash 1,000 bushels a day and load them on the truck, and then they'd take them to the granary. And I just wish sometime that thing would break down so you could catch your breath, because, boy, I tell you, pitching bundles, you get a rest between going after a load, and coming in. But in sacking, you're there all the time.
Families braved long winters. For them, hard work was a matter of survival.
And I used to say that people, when I first came here, like the early homesteaders or cowboys, and if they want to be able to get through the winter, they better have at least $50 they've made during the summer and an elk. If you didn't have those, why, it'd be a little hard to make through the winter. You could figure at least 6 months out of the year you'd be snowed in, or not only snowed in, but just so you couldn't get around and do anything.
The old saying that the cattle are to sell to pay the bills and elk are to eat was something that every rancher followed. We got elk in the fall, and that was our winter's meat, so to speak, and we didn't eat much beef, I'll tell you. There were bills to pay, and you had to depend upon the cattle, the check that you got for your cattle shipment to pay the bills.
Some of the locals found ways to supplement their incomes. They marketed Western-style vacation to rich tourists. Now, by the dozen, they came from the east by train. They jostled over Teton Pass on a buckboard wagon, entering the valley landlocked by the Tetons. They would stay for weeks and months, living the life of a Westerner, or at least a privileged Westerner.
I know when I was a kid, it wasn't unusual at all for me to talk with sons and daughters of dudes, as we called them in those days, and I guess we still do. They had seen much more of Jackson Hole than I had, because we were busy irrigating and haying and doing the chores on the ranch while they came out here and could spend the summer. They'd tell me about the different mountains they'd climbed and the peaks they'd ridden up, and they really had seen Jackson Hole more intimately than I had, despite the fact that I was born and raised here.
Now, homesteaders like Albert and Lida Gabby, well, they transformed their property into guest quarters. They ran the Square G Dude Ranch, where Bob Crandenberg worked for years.
Get the wood out and build the furniture and haul water. For 2 years, we didn't have a well. I had to haul all the water from String Lake with 8-gallon milk cans. And we had at that time, we had about 30 cabins. And then in the wintertime, I'd put up about 50 ton of ice off of String Lake.
Now, even during the Great Depression, demand for the Dude Ranch experience was high among wealthy American tourists. Millionaires relished the anonymity of Western life, trading their cufflinks for cowboy boots. In the 1930s, cash-strapped Jackson Hole residents opened their doors to travelers who still had money to spend on leisure. Coulter Heiler established the Bear Paw Ranch, where his son Jack grew up.
First of all, Dad and Mother felt that for a dude ranch to be really good, it had to have good beds, good horses, good food. Those were the three essentials. The day started out with the wranglers going out to bring in the horses, going out at 5, bringing them in. About the time the dudes came into breakfast, I'd come in when I was pretty sure they were all there and say, "What do you want to do today?" We're thinking, anybody want to go on a picnic? How many want to go fishing? We're going to have a moonlight ride tonight down for a picnic on the Lower Ranch. How many would like to come?
On Sundays, the dudes would take a break from picnics and riding to visit the Chapel of the Transfiguration in Moose.
And we'd go on up to the chapel, and we descended on the chapel in a most unchurch-like way. They came in from the dude ranches on the Barbie Sea, the White Grass, the Half Moon, the Bear Paw, and we charged the chapel. We come galloping in. We always timed it with the stagecoach. And the Barbie Sea had a stagecoach too. And as the stagecoach came down the Dugway off the bench, they'd hit a gallop. So we would too, and we'd all converge on the chapel. And I do think a lot of people went to chapel just for that fun. Went to chapel just for that fun.
The romance of the West lured tourists to Jackson, and even attracted one of the nation's richest men, John D. Rockefeller, Jr. His father was the founder of the Standard Oil Company and grew to become history's first recorded billionaire. In 1926, John D. Rockefeller, Jr. vacationed in Yellowstone with his wife Abby and their 3 sons. Now, Park Superintendent Horace Albright served as their personal guide, driving them through the park in a convertible automobile. Now, Albright was hoping that Rockefeller would consider supporting the Jackson Hole plan discussed earlier in Maud Noble's cabin. So he invited the Rockefellers on a drive south to the Tetons.
So we started down in the morning. We went across the dam and down through the woods, close to the mountains and they were immediately struck by the condition of the roadsides. There was a new telephone line being built right alongside the road, but on the mountainside where it shouldn't have been. Then we came across the ramshackle abandoned ranch. There were fences down, buildings fallen in, and then there was a gasoline station, and then there was a hot dog stand, and things already coming in. It didn't look good, you see. It was generally a draggy place. We hadn't gone a great many miles before Mr. Rockefeller said, Mr. Albright, he said, why are these properties around here in this condition? Well, I said, they're privately owned. They don't belong to the government. I said, the Forest Service hadn't any control of them, and if we had this in the park, we wouldn't have any control of them. I said, then I said, we hope to have some of this area added to the park. Well, he and Mr. Rockefeller were very much upset by what they saw. They saw the possibilities. They were foresighted enough to see what could happen to the country if it was when some controls put on it. So very shortly, he said to me, I want you to, if you would, please, he said, have an estimate made of what it would cost to acquire these properties and a map with it, and bring it to me, send it to me next winter in New York.
Rockefeller's request for the property estimate came early in the morning. The tour continued all day. They headed south to the Barbie Sea Dude Ranch and the J.Y. Ranch in Phillips Lake. At the end of the day, Albright drove them to a scenic view.
Because I had something else I wanted to do. I wanted to show them the valley. So we came back up and left the main road and went over on a ridge where we could overlook the whole valley. We climbed up quite a little ways on this ridge on an old tote road. Anyway, there was quite a high point there where you could look out over the whole upper part of the valley. You could see almost down to Jackson. You could see clear across the valleys. Probably the first view Mr. Rockefeller had of the entire upper valley. And I told him there that as he looked at it, he was astounded at the beauty of it and the size of it. It was late afternoon, the shadows of the mountains were going clear across. It was a very, very picturesque and a very lovely scene.
Now, they were silent at first. Then Albright told Rockefeller about the plan developed at Ma Noble's cabin 3 years earlier.
I told him that we had long had a dream to preserve all that country, all of it, while he was so entranced with the view. But he never said anything. So we got back in the cars and we went on back to the lodge.
A month later, Albright traveled to Rockefeller's corporate headquarters in New York City. He hand-delivered a map and an estimate for buying the ramshackle properties around Jenny Lake.
As soon as I unrolled my map and showed it to him, he took a quick look at it and he said, "Oh, Mr. Albright, that isn't what I asked you for." Well, I said, "Well, Mr. Rockefeller, this is quite a big project here. These contain all those places you saw there that morning when we were traveling along." And I said, "It's going to cost about more than $200,000. No, he said, "That's not what I asked you about at all." He said, "I'm sure it's not what I asked for. I don't see how you could have been so mistaken." No, he said, "What I'm thinking about," he said, "you took us to a high point where we could see out over the whole valley on our way back," he said. And he said, "You told me about a project you had," he said, "and you referred to it as a dream." And he said, it looked to me like an ideal project. He said, "Mr. Albright, I'm only interested in ideals." And he said, "That's what I expected you to bring me." Well, I said, "Mr. Rockefeller, you didn't tell me that. Surely you didn't tell me that. I couldn't have overlooked it. I'm sure I couldn't. I said, that would cost you well over $1 million, perhaps $2 million. And he said, "Well, that's what I wanted." He said, "I'm not interested in this other one at all." I could hardly grasp it. I'd come in there with a $250,000 project, and I was about to win a million or two, don't you see?
Now the dream of the Jackson Hole plan would become a reality. Rockefeller was in. He would buy up private land in the valley to turn it over to the National Park Service.
John D. Rockefeller Jr. is a man of great wealth, inherited, looked for meaning in his life. You know, we all look for meaning no matter how wealthy we are. And I think he found that that doing something for the environment would be a noble thing to do, and doing something for history also, for the culture of America.
An earlier conservation victory in Jackson helped pave the way for Rockefeller's project. During the devastating winter of 1908, thousands of elk died of starvation. Stephen Leake, one of Jackson's pioneer settlers, he went to Washington to lobby for the elk protection. His haunting photographs persuaded Congress. They passed a bill that created the National Elk Refuge from private properties donated to the federal government. Now, for decades to follow, tourists would visit the refuge to get a glimpse of the wild elk.
The bulls pull out and congregate in herds by themselves, and the cows and calves sort of by themselves, but that is quite an attraction. And with the sheep mountain in the background, it's quite a view. And I know as I've driven north in the wintertime, lots of tourists have stopped along the way with glasses and with cameras taking pictures of the elk.
Well, more and more locals were coming to terms with the conservation efforts. A petition circulated. Supporters of the Jackson Hole plan signed the endorsement. 97 locals formally agreed to sell thousands of their acres to become part of the preserve.
I didn't care who was behind it. I was for the park, and I was willing to sell out to help make this park. So future generation would have the same thing to look at as I did when I came in here in 24.
Now, Rockefeller knew property prices would escalate if locals discovered who was behind the purchases. So he created the Snake River Land Company, a proxy buying firm. Salt Lake City lawyer Harold Fabian served as the administrator.
And Harold Fabian became the vice president of the Snake River Land Company, partly because he was quite an outdoors person, an outdoorsman, and he really enjoyed being up here and really got involved in it, you know, both from a professional point of view, but also from, I think, a personal point of view.
Now, Harold Fabian and other key players in the Snake River Land Company, they had no idea that Rockefeller was backing the project. No one told them that the land would be given to the National Park Service.
People were asking me who was back of it, and I couldn't tell them because I didn't know. Nobody told me. And so they started to speculate. And one speculation, one guess was that it was the Union Pacific Railroad. We're going to make another Sun Valley over here. And another one was that it was underlain with a big oil pool, and some oil magnate was back of it. Well, they were getting close on that, except there was no oil under here. And the last one was that I was an emissary of the Mormon Church, and they were going to make a Mormon settlement out of it.
The Bishop of Jackson Hole.
And I was to be the Bishop of Jackson Hole. I'm not a member of the LDS Church.
The Snake River Land Company hid its secrets from the Jackson ranchers.
We were of the impression that they were going to run cattle and continue a ranching operation, not too much unlike that which was existing at that time.
Times were tough on the range. Some ranchers were near destitute, ready to sell their property.
The ranchers had benefited a lot from feeding Europe after World War I was over. It was the Hoover Plan, and so the cattle business was really good. The Hoover Plan expired, and people were pretty hard up. And so they were willing to sell. It was all willing buyer, willing seller.
It's a cold, forbidding country. It's very heavy winters. The winter comes early and stays late. And these people who went in there, none of them ever achieved any fortune. And they were in bad financial condition in the early 20s. There weren't many, if any, you could call prosperous. That's why values were so low. Much of the land could have been bought, I suppose, for $15 or $20 an acre. I doubt if any was bought that cheaply. But the buying went slowly, and
Buying picked up when the Snake River Land Company hired a resident banker, Robert Miller. He was known as the wealthiest person in town and called old 12% because of his steep interest rates. At the time, banks were going bust all over Wyoming, and Miller knew his borrowers could pay back their loans if they sold to the Snake River Land Company.
Whether he twisted people's arms, whether he paid them less than the true value of the land, will always be in debate. There's kind of a dichotomy here. They want to pay fair prices, and yet Rockefeller is a businessman. And he approaches Miller as a businessman through, of course, Fabian. And he says that we think this land is worth about $1,300,000 in that range. However, if you can get it for $1 million or less, we will give you a bonus of $15,000. So this is kind of hard-headed businessman that takes advantage of struggling homesteaders in many cases.
Every piece that Mr. Miller, that Bobby Miller sold to Mr. Rockefeller, he was willing to sell. That's fine, willing buyer, willing seller. But it turned out that some of those were mortgages which he foreclosed in order to have the property to sell. And that was hardly willing buyer and willing seller. And when the Rockefellers found that out, they severed their relationship with Bobby Miller. Robert Miller went from an ardent supporter to an opponent. And I was all over that, I think.
A conservation milestone would be reached in the winter of 1929. That's when President Calvin Coolidge signed the bill establishing Grand Teton National Park. The park encompassed the Teton Range and some scenic lakes at the base of the peaks. But neither Horace Albright nor John D. Rockefeller Jr. were satisfied by the park's creation. There was no protection for the expansive valley at the base of the mountains. they wanted more of the land to be under federal management. So Rockefeller's Snake River Land Company continued to sweep through Jackson. By the close of the decade, Rockefeller's proxy firm had purchased 25,000 acres. But rumors were spreading.
You know, John D., it's fun to tell the story because he always said that, you know, the story goes around that he was buying so much, they said that they'd see green grass grow in the streets of Jackson, Wyoming.
Rockefeller's advisors thought it was time to disclose his role in the Snake River Land Company. In April 1930, Rockefeller issued a press release announcing his involvement. He revealed plans to turn the land over to the National Park Service.
In retrospect, Rockefeller and Albright and the company made a mistake. I think they should have come clean right away and said, this is what we want to do, and put out all their the information of what their plans were. But they didn't do that. And obviously the rationale for that was that if people knew that Rockefeller was behind this, that land values would soar. And they would have. And instead of probably $1.5 million, Rockefeller probably would have had to pay $2.5 million. But I think they would have avoided a lot of the animosity in the valley.
Rockefeller hoped the revelation would accelerate the Jackson Hole plan. He hadn't expected opposition.
Mr. Rockefeller was behind the Snake River Land Company. They all thought he should have paid more. He paid what they asked. They had no complaint, really. But everybody complained bitterly. He should have paid more. He could afford to pay me twice that. So that was some opposition.
When it was revealed in 1930, there was really an outcry against not only Rockefeller, but Albright, but the federal government, the Easterners, whatever. And they said that they felt like they were trying to take over the valley, that they were trying to monopolize the tourist business in the valley. They were just taking over what had been their land.
Cattle Baron Robert Carey would exploit the uproar. He was the son of the state's former governor, and he was running for Senate. Like his father, he wanted the federal government out of Western affairs. Robert Carey's ears were to Jackson's people, and his eyes were on the Grand Teton. A local newspaper opposed to Rockefeller. When he became a junior senator in 1930, he began to challenge Rockefeller.
He tried to approach John D. Rockefeller and see if we can work out a compromise. His compromise would be that all of the land in northern Jackson Hole, some of Teton National Forest, plus the land that Rockefeller had purchased, would all become state park. Well, that simply was not what John D. Rockefeller wanted. He was very committed to a national point of view, and that was represented by the National Park Service.
Senator Carey threatened a congressional probe into Rockefeller's Snake River Land Company.
But there had been so much bad press already about the Snake River Land Company that they said, if you want to investigate us, you go right ahead and do so.
Accusations about the Snake River Land Company splashed across the pages of the Grand Teton newspaper. Senator Carey claimed the Park Service had burned the property of defiant locals. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about the buyers and the sellers.
It was good for some, but the only thing that was kind of, hard to say this, that some of his workers were a little forceful in pushing the people out. They'd have different ways of getting them to get out, which wasn't too ethical as far as people were concerned. But so many people that had homesteaded, they just homesteaded on a thread, that anything was a good offer for them. And so they bought up a lot of the homesteaders.
There was a lot of opposition, but the people that sold were never forced to sell. That is absolutely untrue. It's very hard to make a living. Their places weren't big enough, and God knows the conditions. It's a long winter, and they were all just on the edge of making a living. So it looked pretty good when they got a chance to go down to Colorado and buy a real ranch,
Carey persuaded his colleagues in the Senate to investigate the company's buying tactics at a 1933 hearing. Eager for scandal, the national press mobilized to Jackson.
Albert Gabby has had a homestead out on Jenny Lake that the Park Service did, I think, intervene with the General Land Office to try to get that denied. And that was brought out in the hearings, and it was reversed, and Gabby did get his homestead claim. But outside of that, there just wasn't much at all. There wasn't enough to make a story. So it all ended up as kind of a failure, certainly from the point of view of Carey, to reveal any wrongdoing by the Park Service or the Snake River Land Company.
Now, Carey would not give up. He joined forces with other delegates from the western states who struggled against the federal interests. While lawmakers arm-wrestled in Washington, D.C., Jackson's locals were caught up in their own competition.
And come rodeo time, we'd all bring in our horses. It was a community competition. But you came in from the ranch, you had races, as well as the roping and stuff. And you brought your horses in. And there'd probably be, for that, the time of the rodeo, a couple hundred horses around town, riding around town.
Saturday night, and the group from the ranch would go in, and we'd dance in the bars, which was 3 bars for a long time, and you'd just go from one to the other and dance. And it was got pretty wild sometimes. The Cowboy Bar, log cabin on the corner, and the Frontier Saloon.
There were some wild things that happened. It was truly the West in the old days, the ranching West. The Saturday nights could be pretty wild. There were always fights somewhere at Saturday night. And once in a while, somebody hit somebody over the head with a 6-gun butt instead of his fist, and that made a complication. In the old days, you went to town, you saw everybody you knew. And so gambling was wide open in Jackson for years, even though it was illegal. And a lot of the dudes enjoyed gambling.
Now, one of the more famous gambling moves of the day was made by John D. Rockefeller Jr. himself. Only his bluff, it wasn't at the poker table. Rockefeller had invested almost $1.5 million to buy up 35,000 acres in Jackson. And for years, his plans to give the land to the National Park Service had been thwarted. Congress had stalled and squabbled for nearly a decade. He was growing impatient.
So he decided to, long about the time after we got in the war, that he was tired of it all. Every once in a while, in the 30s, he'd say, I better get out of that. He said, even if we only get 10 cents on the dollar. He said, I think we better put the land on the market and close the books and so forth. Charlie or I or both of us would persuade him not to do it, not to take that step, at least not yet.
Rockefeller brewed up a strategy with the National Park Service. They could bypass Congress altogether. They only needed one man to support the project, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Antiquities Act gave him the authority to put the land under federal protection. So, in November of 1942, Rockefeller wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes. He threatened to sell every acre if the government failed to formally preserve it.
He had purchased that land with the idea of giving it to the Park Service, but he was becoming disappointed and a little disillusioned with the lack of specific activity on the park to include it, and he felt that he might have to make other disposals of the property. I'm certain knew very well that would trigger some action.
Many historians say they think that was probably a bluff on his part, that he really, after spending all the time and energy on this project for Jackson Hole, he was not willing to just give it up and ship it down the river. But it did work. The bluff worked. The secretary did take it seriously.
Secretary Ickes hurried to schedule a meeting with the president.
He warned Roosevelt. He said, you're going to take some heat on this if you go ahead and make this proclamation, make it a national monument. But he did go ahead and do it.
Roosevelt signed an executive order establishing the Jackson Hole National Monument in the spring of 1943. The monument encompassed the valley floor east of the Tetons. It protected hundreds of thousands of acres, including Rockefeller's land. The monument also absorbed nearly 100,000 acres of Teton National Forest. Jackson residents had for years enjoyed grazing rights on the forest land. Now they felt betrayed.
We felt that the Antiquities Act had been stretched far beyond its reasonable dimensions, that when it was passed in 1906 it was never contemplated to permit the accomplishment of what was then accomplished in Jackson Hole. Well, a number of boys were in the service then, as you know, and almost without exception, every serviceman from Jackson Hole just felt as though he had a knife stuck in his back. That's very literally true. They felt that they were away from home fighting to protect their country, and while they were away from home, their homes had been taken away from them.
Wyoming Governor Lester Hunt made a formal declaration nullifying the monument.
I shall utilize all police authority at my disposal to evict from the proposed Jackson Hole National Monument any federal official who attempts to assume authority. Governor Lester Hunt.
I had been county commissioner for 8 years, and when the monument was created, our concern was that the property, we assumed that the property within the monument area would eventually pass into federal ownership. And if that were to happen, we felt that we would lose a very significant portion of our taxes that were levied on the privately owned lands in Teton County.
You have this powerful federal government invading the rights of struggling cattlemen, struggling homesteaders, just trying to make a living.
On May 2nd, 1943, Hollywood cowboy Wallace Berry mounted his horse and brandished his gun. He joined with other armed ranchers as they drove their cattle across the National Monument. It was a PR stunt staged by the local newspaper editor, and it worked. Time magazine arrived on the scene.
We got Wallace Berry to lead a cattle drive across the monument lands, and we were armed with rifles, ostensibly in open defiance of any objections that might be raised by the National Park Service. We drove cattle across the Gros Ventre River and across monument land, and Wallace Berry was right at the head of it to ostensibly shoot anybody who might try to stop us. No one tried to stop us, but we did get a lot of attention.
In Washington, Western lawmakers were outraged. They tried pushing bill after bill, hoping to keep the federal government from infringing on state sovereignty. But after a few short years, support had evaporated. Concern for states' rights gave way to post-war patriotism. The Allied forces had defeated Germany and Japan. The boys were back as heroes. Money was flowing, families throughout the country crowded into their station wagons. They drove to rediscover America. They visited national parks. Jackson Hole boomed as a gateway for tourists on their way to Yellowstone. Locals were making money off of visitors. Jess and John Wirt opened the town's first modern hotel.
I've always felt that the building of the Wirt Hotel has done more to promote the business in the town of Jackson than any other single business has ever started. It gave the business people and the tourists a very fine place to stay.
When they first set those silver dollars in there, people would try to pick them out. They're set in some sort of resin. And people would sit there and try to pick them out with it subtly. And the Wirts always laughed about it because by the time anybody got $1 out of there, he spent an awful lot of dollars on drinks holding his spot.
Jackson Hole bustled with tourists. The town businesses thrived.
In the wintertime, that was the place for young people to go to watch movies, and then the drugstore stayed open until after the show was concluded, and people went from the movie house to Bruce Porter's fountain to have a milkshake or a malted milk. It saddened a lot of people to see that operation go out of business. It did me.
By 1950, Jackson residents were beginning to see the economic future in tourism. Once defiant locals prospered.
people had been here for years and years and just doing what they've been doing, they couldn't see any future. Those people those days come in here, migrated, got them a little ranch, and getting them making a living, and that was about all. That's all they thought they could ever do anyway. They couldn't see any future. And I could see that the tourist business was coming to this country and nobody was going to stop it. As long as those mountains stand up there.
Feelings were changing, and residents and lawmakers began to negotiate. Their bargain culminated in a Senate bill signed into law by President Harry S. Truman on September 14, 1950. The act abolished the Jackson Hole National Monument and incorporated those lands into the 1929 Grand Teton National Park. The result would be a vast 310,000-acre park. Wrapped up in the legislation was a series of important provisions designed to balance the private and the public interests.
And really, today, Grand Teton National Park stands as a park that was created through compromise. So those compromises really have defined the way this national park does business and the way this community looks, perhaps, at the national park.
Part of the agreement granted the state of Wyoming immunity from any future executive orders creating a national monument.
And I believe Wyoming is the only state that has that encumbrance. And even today, we still see the same kinds of local opposition to a national monument creation that we saw in the 1920s and 30s with Grand Teton National Park.
The bill protected landowners whose property had been enveloped by the national park. Grazing rights were granted to ranchers for the duration of their lives and the lives of their heirs. The Jackson cattle industry has struggled in spite of the compromises made between the national parks and local ranchers.
It's just about on its way out. There aren't very many. I don't think there's a single ranch family that I know of in Jackson Hole that is dependent upon cattle ranching for its main source of income.
In the years to follow the expansion of Grand Teton National Park, green cash from tourists would sprout up in place of grasses for grazing. Tax revenues from tourists dramatically increased when John D. Rockefeller Jr. developed lodging and restaurant concessions from Jackson Lake down to the Gros Ventre River.
In 1950, Mr. Rockefeller built the Grand Teton Lodge Company, and other improvements were made on the area, which of course all went on the tax rolls. And the revenues from tourists who came here and visitors expanded exponentially as well. I'm one who was very critical of the Rockefellers and did all I was able to do to try to thwart their plans. And I'm grateful now that I wasn't successful, because I have to appreciate, as everyone else does, the uniqueness and the beauty of this area. I've told them on more than one occasion that I'm glad I lost that fight.
The development of the park ushered in a new era in Western recreation. Grand Teton National Park received loads of World War II surplus goods from the federal government. And somehow, a few dozen inflatable footbridge pontoons landed on the banks of the Snake River.
See those big black lumps sitting over in the sagebrush there? He says, "You know what those are?" Mr. Lilly obviously didn't know. He said, "Well, they're inflatable bridge pontoons." And he said, "Do you suppose anybody would they'd have any use for floating down the river?" And they talked about this for a bit.
The following summer, Raymond Lilly began offering rafting trips down the Snake River.
So I got a job working on the river, and just as a summer job, and here I am more than half a lifetime later, and it's still fun, still a fun job. In that span of time, my wife Patty and I and Dick and Barbara Barker became partners and co-owners of a rafting business that in the last 40 years has carried about 1.25 million people safely on river adventures here in Jackson Hole. And that's what we still do. As you move south, downstream on the river through that central part of the valley, the relative position of peaks one to another is constantly changing, and depending on the time of the day and the light, the cloud effects and so forth, it can be a very rewarding part of the river trip. And then, of course, there's always the chance that you will see wildlife, especially good chances within Grand Teton National Park.
Decades before the river runners floated the Snake River, mountaineering clubs throughout the West flocked to the craggy cliffs of the Tetons, drawn by heavy promotion from Yellowstone Park Superintendent Horace Albright. Pioneering climber Paul Petzold first began guiding Teton ascents in the mid-1920s. Since then, thousands of guided alpinists and expert climbers have made it to the summit of the Grand, 13,770 feet above sea level.
My first permanent job, or long-range job that I had, was working at Jack Dornan's up at Moose, and there I was the dishwasher. But it was a beautiful place to work. Boy, I didn't mind being a dishwasher at all, with scenery like that to look out the window at.
In the spring of 1971, Teton mountain guide Bill Briggs became the first person to descend the Grand on skis. As a mountain guide, he had climbed the peak on dozens of occasions. Now it was time for him to blaze trail on the way down.
I wanted to do it because it was a natural ski descent. You had one challenge after another, after another, after another.
Skiing in Jackson Hole began as a transportation necessity during the winter, and over time, it would evolve into a sport.
People would tack a strip of elk hide onto the bottom of their skis with the hair pointing back, and you could climb up a pretty good slope with that piece of elk hide nailed onto your skis. But we didn't make very many downhill runs. We found that for every one we went down, we had to climb up. That lessened our enthusiasm for downhill runs.
In 1939, Snow King Ski Area became Jackson's first winter recreational resort.
There was a fire on Snow King that took out a lot of the trees, and it became a popular place to go up and ski down, recreational skiing. And what they used was a single pole. You dragged it on one side and you dragged it on the other like a canoe, okay? And steering your skis like a canoe down Snow King was the way it was done.
Years later, in 1965, developer Paul McCollister created a European-style ski area called the Jackson Hole Mountain Resort. The steep terrain has attracted tourists and local ski bums alike.
Jackson Hole's the biggest, steepest place with the best zone. It's got the best skiers. So if you want to become a skier or a ski bum, this is where you need to be, because you'll be able to measure yourself against the best. Everybody's just so burly and so gnarly. Guys are going and climbing the Grand Teton and the Middle Teton and the South Teton in one day. And then you got ranchers that birth calves when it's 40 below and ride bulls and bucking broncos over here at the rodeo, You got guys that go backpacking for 100 miles. I could just go on and on. You got world-class cross-country skiers and kayakers. So you get in that mindset. If you can ski Jackson Hole well, you could ski anywhere in the world.
Resort development and park tourism dramatically changed the economy of Jackson Hole. The 1950 expansion of Grand Teton National Park, along with the federally protected National Forest and Elk Refuge, left only 3% of land that could be privately owned in Teton County. It wasn't long before private property value began to rise. The middle-class entrepreneurs and service workers who had for years called Teton County home were finding they could no longer afford to live there.
Well, my parents followed my grandparents out here in the late 50s. My grandfather bought acres of land in Wilson for $60 an acre. When my parents moved out here and bought land at Teton Village for $60,000, my grandparents thought he was crazy for buying the land. And then now, if he could buy lot for under $200,000 or $300,000 somewhere in the valley, you'd be lucky.
It's become very difficult for people in the service sector. Even if they are a two-family income, they have considerable difficulty in affording a piece of property, a small piece of property, and building a modest home on it.
But it was always an issue. Housing in here has been difficult from the time I came here as a young school teacher's wife, and I think that we were first offered a garage in which to live with our two little girls.
Today, residents of Jackson live in the aftermath of the Jackson Hole Plan developed some 80 years ago at Ma Noble's cabin. What began as a grassroots vision grew to become Grand Teton National Park, a park built on compromise between clashing interests. Nowadays, locals face daily compromises as they balance their livelihoods and lifestyles against the legacy of conservation.
Sometimes I feel a little bit hypocritical. I mean, I'm a liberal-minded person. I'm a huge supporter of federal lands and open space, and I don't necessarily want to see things get ruined, if you will, by development. But I got involved in a business that involves cutting down trees and making them into houses. I guess what I always fall back on is the fact that only 3% of the land is privately held. There are always going to be vast open spaces in Jackson Hole, and I find that very comforting.
Human pressures don't stop at building development. Increased flights to and from Jackson Hole Airport have ignited local debate. The tourist industry, the national parks, and the cattle industry continue to wrangle over the degree in which humans should interact with the land.
In many people's minds, conservation is equated with costing something, costing a freedom, costing them an opportunity to do something. And I think the biggest challenge we have is to convince people that conservation pays. It may not pay off as fast as we're used to, quarterly statements, yearly reports, 5-year plans even, but it does pay. I'm convinced it will pay.
Contemporary political groups, environmentalists, and homeowners carry on the civic dialogue that began in 1923 within the log walls of Ma Noble's cabin.
We have a sign up there. It used to be there forever, but it's still on Teton Park. It says, the last of the Old West. Where? Where do you see the Old West here?
And I always say that there would have been a Ferris wheel on top of the Grand if it hadn't been for that conservation effort.
We established a core, a pristine core in which the national park runs. Outside of that core, there's going to be failures and there's going to be compromises. But I think in the main, they would have great admiration for the commitment to keeping it in a pristine area, the commitment to wildlife, the commitment of having it a meaningful experience for American tourists.
Just, I sometimes get goosebumps, I sometimes get a tear in my eye because of the beauty of the sunrise on the Tetons, or because a majestic bull moose is standing on the side of the road with a full rack, and I just think, wow, this is my commute in the morning, and other people in urban areas are dealing with traffic, congestion, bumper to bumper, watching the taillights of the car in front of them, and I'm just worried about whether or not the moose is going to cross the road.
You've got to be very robust here. You've got to be the kind of person that thinks it's neat that it's 38 below. Or 95 degrees. You've got to think it's really neat how high the winds are, and you've got to really enjoy the sunset and the sunrise every single day and look at the stars every night and just tell yourself how lucky you are to live here.
As they gathered round the hearth more than 80 years ago, the visionary group dreamt of a future. They wanted Jackson to become a museum on the hoof, a place where the Old West spirit of the range could flourish alongside conservation. Locals today can only guess if the course of history had gone according to the Jackson Hole Plan.
I don't think they had in mind the creation of a park, but simply this museum on the hoof where the elements which were extant here at that time would be continued and perpetuated. I would think they would find merit in what has taken place here.
There's a place in Wyoming I'm longing to be, where the air is so pure and the wind blows free, where the cowboys gather round the campfire so bright, yodel and sing in the long starry night. Roll on, little doggies, roll on, roll on, roll on, little doggies, roll on. Night after night I sit all alone, watching the stars and the pale silvery moon. I fancy nearby my pinto I see. Back in Wyoming I'm longing to be.
The Jackson Hole story is made possible in part by a gift from the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Fund and the contributing members of KUED.